convene at Chicago to elect presidential and vice presidential nominees and to formulate one of the most important programs.
April 12, 1945, 5:25 p.m. The White House. Harry S. Truman rushed from the Capitol to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, summoned urgently but told nothing. When he arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt placed her hand on his shoulder. "Harry, the president is dead." Truman stood speechless, then asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor Roosevelt's response would prove prophetic. "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." At 7:09 p.m., Chief Justice Harlan Stone administered the oath of office. Harry Truman, vice president for exactly 82 days, became president of the United States. He inherited a world war in its final violent phase, an atomic bomb program he didn't know existed, agreements with Stalin he hadn't been briefed on, a cabinet that viewed him as an accident of history, a Democratic Party that had never wanted him as vice president. Within hours, Truman began discovering how little Franklin Roosevelt had trusted him with. Within days, he realized Roosevelt's cabinet considered themselves guardians of a sacred vision, one they believed Truman was unqualified to understand. Within 18 months, Truman would fire or force out nearly every member of Roosevelt's inner circle. The political establishment would call it a purge. Truman called it necessity. This is the story of what happened when a president died without preparing his successor, when institutional loyalty to one man's vision became opposition to reality, when Roosevelt's cabinet fought harder to preserve FDR's legacy than to serve the living president, and how Truman's ruthless dismantling of Roosevelt's team, painful, politically costly, and deeply controversial, may have saved Western democracy from Soviet expansion. The vice president who knew nothing. To understand the crisis Truman inherited, you need to understand how completely Roosevelt had excluded him. The 1944 vice presidential selection. Harry Truman didn't want to be vice president. He was happy as a senator from Missouri. But Democratic Party leaders had a problem. They couldn't keep Henry Wallace. Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 1945, was brilliant, idealistic, and politically radioactive. Conservative Democrats and party bosses considered him too liberal, too naive about the Soviets, too likely to pursue radical policies if he became president. And Roosevelt's health was clearly failing. The vice presidency in 1944 was effectively the presidency in waiting. Party leaders pressured Roosevelt to drop Wallace. After complex negotiations, they settled on Truman. Moderate, acceptable to all factions, not threatening to anyone. Safe. Roosevelt accepted the decision but never embraced Truman. The relationship remained formal and distant. The 82 days, from inauguration, January 20th, 1945, until Roosevelt's death, April 12, 1945. Truman served as vice president for exactly 82 days. During those 82 days, Roosevelt met privately with Truman exactly twice. Both meetings were brief. Neither involved substantive policy discussion. Truman was not invited to RT war strategy meetings, cabinet meetings, except ceremonial occasions, diplomatic conferences, planning sessions for post-war Europe, discussions about the atomic bomb, briefings on agreements with Stalin. He was kept as ignorant as any senator despite being one heartbeat from the presidency. Why Roosevelt excluded Truman? Multiple factors. Roosevelt's working style. FDR compartmentalized information, keeping control by ensuring no one person knew everything. This was normal for him, but catastrophic when he died suddenly. Roosevelt's health denial. FDR knew he was dying, but refused to fully confront it. Briefing Truman thoroughly would have meant admitting his presidency was ending. Lack of respect? Roosevelt had wanted another running mate. He viewed Truman as a political compromise, not a successor to be groomed. Trust. Roosevelt trusted very few people with his complete vision. His inner circle, men who'd served him for over a decade, knew his thinking. Truman was an outsider. April 12, 1945. The first 24 hours. When Truman took the oath of office, he inherited a government built entirely around Franklin Roosevelt's personality and vision. The immediate crisis. Truman faced multiple urgent decisions. The war in Europe, Germany was collapsing. Victory was weeks away, but final military operations required presidential direction. The war in the Pacific. Japan showed no signs of surrendering. Invasion planning continued. Casualties were projected to be catastrophic. The Soviet alliance, Stalin's cooperation was deemed essential for defeating Japan and building post-war peace, but Soviet actions in Eastern Europe were already troubling. Post-war planning, occupation zones, international organizations, reconstruction, all required immediate decisions. Truman knew almost nothing about any of it. The first meetings. That first evening and the following days, cabinet members and military leaders briefed the new president. The briefings revealed how little Truman knew. Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, briefed Truman on military operations. Truman learned details about campaigns he'd only read about in newspapers. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius briefed on diplomatic situation. Truman discovered Roosevelt had made commitments and agreements Truman hadn't been told about. Secretary of War Henry Stimson. On April 25th, 13 days after Roosevelt's death, Stimson told Truman, "I should like to talk to you about a most urgent matter." April 25th, 1945, the most terrible weapon is Secretary of War Henry Stimson's memo to President Truman, April 25th, 1945. "Within 4 months, we shall, in all probability, have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city." The Manhattan Project revelation. For over 3 years, the United States had been developing an atomic bomb. The program employed over 130,000 people, cost over $2 billion, equivalent to over $30 billion today, operated facilities across the country, represented the largest secret military program in history. Vice President Truman had not been told it existed. Stimson's briefing. Stimson explained, the bomb would likely be ready by August. It would be powerful beyond anything previously known. It could end the war with Japan without invasion. It would fundamentally change international relations. The Soviets would learn about it eventually. Decisions about its use would define Truman's presidency. Truman listened, absorbed the information and asked questions, but internally he was stunned that something this momentous had been kept from the vice president. The Roosevelt decision. Roosevelt had deliberately excluded Truman from atomic bomb knowledge. Why? Security. The fewer people who knew, the better. Control. Roosevelt wanted to maintain personal control over the decision. Succession planning failure. Roosevelt never fully confronted his mortality. Including Truman would have meant preparing for succession Roosevelt wasn't ready to acknowledge. Trust. Roosevelt's inner circle, Stimson, Leahy, a few others, had earned his trust over years. Truman hadn't. The result? Truman inherited the most important military decision of the war, whether to use the atomic bomb, with less than 4 months to understand it, consult advisors, and decide. Roosevelt's failure to brief him was a catastrophic succession planning failure. The cabinet Truman inherited. Roosevelt's cabinet was filled with men who'd served him for years, some for over a decade. They saw themselves as guardians of Roosevelt's vision. The key figures and their tenure. Henry Morgenthau, Jr., Treasury Secretary, 1934 to 1945. Roosevelt's neighbor from Hyde Park, personal friend, architect of war financing. Over 11 years of service. Harold Ickes, Interior Secretary, 1933 to 1946. Served entire Roosevelt presidency. Roosevelt's conscience, progressive champion. Over 12 years of service. Frances Perkins, Labor Secretary, 1933 to 1945. First female cabinet member. Entire Roosevelt presidency. Champion of New Deal labor reforms. Over 12 years of service. Henry Wallace, Commerce Secretary, 1945 to 1946. Previously Vice President, 1941 to 1945. True believer in Soviet cooperation, convinced he should have been president instead of Truman. James Forrestal, Navy Secretary, 1944 to 1949. Relative newcomer but deeply embedded in Roosevelt's war planning. Henry Stimson, War Secretary, 1940 to 1945. Elder statesman, respected by Roosevelt, guardian of the atomic bomb secret. The mindset. These men shared several beliefs. They knew Roosevelt's mind. Years of service meant they understood FDR's thinking, his vision for post-war peace, his approach to Stalin. They were the continuity. Roosevelt's sudden death threatened to destroy carefully built policies. They saw themselves as protecting that legacy. Truman was temporary. Many believed Truman was an accidental president who would serve out FDR's term and step aside in 1948. They were the permanent government. They knew better. Truman was a former haberdasher from Missouri, a machine politician. They were architects of the New Deal and victory in World War II. The experience gap was vast. This created a fundamental problem. The cabinet saw its job as preserving Roosevelt's vision, even if that meant operating around rather than with the new president. The information control problem. In Truman's first weeks, he discovered a disturbing pattern. Roosevelt's cabinet controlled information and used that control to guide policy in directions they preferred. The Yalta problem. In February 1945, 2 months before Roosevelt's death, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta to plan post-war Europe. Major agreements were reached about Daewoo, Soviet territorial demands in Eastern Europe, Poland's borders and government, German occupation zones, Soviet entry into the war against Japan, formation of the United Nations. When Truman asked for complete briefings on what was agreed at Yalta, he discovered documentation was incomplete. Some agreements were verbal understandings between Roosevelt and Stalin, not written treaties. Different officials had different understandings. Roosevelt had compartmentalized information. What he told Leahy wasn't what he told Stettinius. Roosevelt's declining health affected record-keeping. FDR's physical and mental decline at Yalta meant some discussions weren't properly documented or remembered consistently. Officials gave Truman selective information. Cabinet members briefed Truman based on their interpretation of what Roosevelt intended, which often reflected their own policy preferences. The Polish question. The most contentious Yalta issue was Poland. Stalin demanded Dollar. Polish borders shifted west, giving the Soviet Union Polish territory. A friendly Polish government, meaning Soviet-dominated. Free elections, which Stalin defined very differently than the West. Roosevelt had agreed to some version of this, believing he could work with Stalin to ensure Poland remained genuinely independent. When Truman asked what exactly Roosevelt had agreed to, officials couldn't give a clear answer, because Roosevelt himself had left the agreements deliberately vague, believing personal relationships would sort out details later. The problem. Truman needed to know what the United States had actually committed to. But Roosevelt's approach, personal diplomacy, vague agreements, reliance on future negotiation meant there wasn't a clear answer. Cabinet members filled this vacuum with their own interpretations, and their interpretations reflected their belief in Roosevelt's vision of Soviet cooperation. April 23, 1945. Truman's first showdown with Stalin. 11 days after becoming president, Truman had his first major confrontation over Soviet policy. The meeting? Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov was in Washington for the UN founding conference. Truman scheduled a meeting to discuss Poland. By late April, the Polish situation was clear. Soviet forces occupied Poland. Stalin was installing a communist government. Non-communist Polish leaders were being arrested. The free elections promised at Yalta weren't happening. Truman's approach. Truman's meeting with Molotov was blunt. He told the Soviet foreign minister that the United States expected the Soviet Union to honor the Yalta agreements about Poland, specifically the provision for free elections and a representative government. Molotov protested. Truman interrupted and repeated his points more forcefully. Molotov, stunned at the directness, said, "I have never been talked to like that in my life." Truman replied, "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." The meeting ended badly. Soviet-American relations were strained. The cabinet reaction. Several Roosevelt cabinet members were appalled at Truman's approach. They believed Roosevelt would never have spoken to the Soviets so harshly. Personal diplomacy and patient negotiation were the Roosevelt way. Truman's bluntness would destroy the carefully built alliance. Stalin would respond better to cooperation than confrontation. These cabinet members began, subtly at first, to work around Truman's approach. They sought to moderate his policies, maintain Roosevelt's vision, and preserve the Soviet alliance Roosevelt had built. The Henry Wallace problem. The clearest example of cabinet opposition to Truman was Henry Wallace. Background. Henry Wallace had been Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 1945. Party leaders forced him off the ticket in 1944 because they considered him too liberal and too sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Roosevelt, as consolation, appointed Wallace as Secretary of Commerce in his fourth-term cabinet. Wallace was still serving when Roosevelt died and Truman became president. Wallace's beliefs. Wallace believed deeply in several principles. Soviet cooperation was possible. Stalin could be trusted if approached with goodwill and understanding. American policy was partly to blame for tensions. U.S. hostility and suspicion created defensive Soviet behavior. Roosevelt's vision must be preserved. FDR had understood how to work with Stalin. Truman was abandoning that wisdom. He should have been president. Wallace believed the 1944 convention had wrongly denied him the vice presidency. He should be president now, not Truman. The policy divide. As Truman's policy toward the Soviet Union became more skeptical and firm, Wallace became increasingly critical, eventually publicly. September 12, 1946, Wallace gave a speech at Madison Square Garden, arguing for Soviet cooperation and directly contradicting Truman's get tough policy. The speech criticized Truman's approach to Stalin, American military buildups, imperialistic American foreign policy. The speech directly undermined Secretary of State James Burns, who was in Paris at that moment negotiating with the Soviets. Truman's response? Initially, Truman said he'd approved Wallace's speech. He'd skimmed it but not read carefully. When the full text became clear, Truman backtracked. The political damage was severe. How could the administration negotiate with the Soviets when a cabinet member was publicly contradicting U.S. policy? September 20th, 1946, Truman fired Wallace. The letter. My dear Mr. Secretary, it is with the most profound regret that I have concluded that it will be best for the country that I request your resignation. Harry Truman. Wallace's firing marked a decisive break. Truman would not tolerate cabinet members who publicly opposed his foreign policy, even if they claimed to be preserving Roosevelt's legacy. The systematic replacement, 1945 to 1947. Between April 1945 and early 1947, Truman replaced nearly every member of Roosevelt's cabinet. The timeline. June 1945. Frances Perkins, Labour, resigned. Roosevelt's longest-serving cabinet member. Truman replaced her with Louis Schwellenbach. July 1945, Edward Stettinius, State, resigned, replaced by James Burns. Though Burns had served under Roosevelt, he was Truman's choice to lead State. September 1945, Henry Morgenthau, Treasury, resigned after Truman rejected his punitive plan for post-war Germany. Replaced by Fred Vinson. February 1946, Harold Ickes, Interior, resigned in protest after Truman nominated someone Ickes opposed, replaced by Julius Krug. September 1946, Henry Wallace, Commerce, fired, replaced by Averell Harriman. January 1947, Robert Hannigan, Postmaster General, resigned, replaced by Jesse Donaldson. July 1947, Henry Stimson, War, had already resigned in September 1945, replaced by Robert Patterson, then Kenneth Royal. The pattern. Within 27 months of becoming president, Truman had replaced every major cabinet member who'd been closely associated with Roosevelt's inner circle. Why? Multiple factors drove Truman's cabinet purge. Policy differences. Truman's emerging policy toward the Soviet Union, what would become containment, diverged fundamentally from Roosevelt's cooperation approach. Cabinet members loyal to FDR's vision opposed Truman's direction. Loyalty questions? Truman needed cabinet members loyal to him, not to a dead president's legacy. Roosevelt's cabinet viewed themselves as guardians, not subordinates. Information control. Roosevelt's cabinet controlled access to information and used that control to shape policy. Truman needed his own team that would serve him, not manipulate him. Political necessity. Some resignations, Perkins, Ickes, were driven by normal political turnover and policy disputes unrelated to Soviet policy. Competence. Some Roosevelt appointees were simply past their prime. Stimson was 78 when Roosevelt died. The policy that proved Truman right. As Truman replaced Roosevelt's cabinet, Soviet actions validated his skepticism about Stalin's intentions. The evidence that accumulated. Poland. Stalin installed a communist government. The promised free elections never occurred. Non-communist political leaders were arrested, exiled, or killed. Romania. Soviet forces oversaw installation of communist government. King Michael was forced to abdicate. Bulgaria. Communist government installed, opposition parties suppressed. Hungary. Communist takeover by 1947. Democracy eliminated. Czechoslovakia, the last Eastern European democracy, fell to communist coup in February 1948. East Germany's Soviet occupation zone became permanent. Berlin divided. The Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill's March 1946 speech crystallized the reality. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Every country in Soviet-occupied territory became a communist dictatorship. The free elections promised at Yalta never materialized. Stalin's territorial demands became permanent Soviet control. The vindication. Roosevelt's vision that personal cooperation with Stalin could produce a lasting peace proved false. Stalin's goals were ideologically driven Soviet expansion, not partnership with the West. Truman's skepticism and his willingness to confront Soviet actions rather than accommodate them proved prescient. The Marshall Plan. June 1947. Secretary of State George Marshall announced the European Recovery Program, $13 billion in economic aid to rebuild Western Europe. The Marshall Plan prevented economic collapse in Western Europe, blocked communist political movements from gaining power through economic despair, demonstrated American commitment to European recovery, drew a clear line, Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe versus American-supported Western Europe. This was Truman's policy, not Roosevelt's. It succeeded. The counterfactual. What if Truman had kept Roosevelt's cabinet? What if Truman had maintained Roosevelt's team and followed their advice? The likely outcomes: more accommodation of Soviet demands. Wallace and others advocated understanding Soviet security concerns and accommodating territorial demands. This might have meant accepting Soviet domination of Eastern Europe as legitimate, not confronting Stalin over Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. No Marshall Plan too provocative to Soviet interests, delayed or no formation of NATO. Possible results. Soviet expansion continues unopposed. Without American economic and military commitment to Western Europe, communist parties might have gained power in France, Italy, and elsewhere. Weaker Western Europe. Without Marshall Plan aid, economic recovery would have been slower, making Western Europe more vulnerable. Later confrontation from weaker position. Eventually, conflict with the Soviet expansion would have occurred, but possibly after Soviets controlled more territory and America had less credibility. Or, alternative scenario, Soviet moderation. Perhaps Stalin would have responded to continued cooperation by moderating his behavior. Maybe Roosevelt's personal relationship really could have produced different outcomes. We can't know. The counterfactual is inherently speculative, but the evidence suggests Stalin's goals were ideological and territorial, not negotiable through personal diplomacy. The loyalty versus competence question. Was Truman's cabinet purge necessary? Or did he destroy valuable institutional knowledge? The case for the purge. Policy coherence required. A president cannot govern effectively if his cabinet publicly opposes his policies. Wallace's case. Soviet policy required realism. Roosevelt's approach was based on assumptions proven false by events. Truman needed advisors who understood Soviet behavior as it actually was, not as FDR hoped it would be. Loyalty matters. Presidents need advisors loyal to them, not to their predecessors' legacies. Fresh perspective required. Roosevelt's long service meant his cabinet had become set in their thinking. New circumstances required new approaches. The case against: institutional knowledge lost. Roosevelt's cabinet had deep understanding of complex policies. Their experience was valuable even if their Soviet policy views were wrong. Political damage. The purge was politically costly. Truman was seen as ruthless, disrespectful of Roosevelt's legacy. Gradual transition possible. Truman could have moved more slowly, incorporating Roosevelt's advisors while gradually reshaping policy. False dichotomy. Not all Roosevelt advisors were wrong about everything. Truman could have kept some while replacing others. The fundamental question: was Roosevelt wrong about Stalin? The Truman versus Roosevelt cabinet conflict ultimately centered on one question: could Stalin be trusted? Roosevelt's view, as interpreted by his cabinet: Stalin was a pragmatic leader who could be negotiated with. Soviet territorial demands were defensive responses to security concerns. Personal relationships and mutual respect could moderate Soviet behavior. Post-war cooperation was achievable through goodwill and compromise. Truman's emerging view: Stalin was an ideological communist committed to expanding Soviet power. Soviet territorial demands were aggressive, not defensive. Stalin respected strength, not goodwill. Cooperation required clear boundaries and credible deterrence. The evidence: every promise Stalin made about free elections and representative governments in Eastern Europe was broken. Soviet occupation became permanent Soviet control. Communist dictatorships were installed everywhere Soviet forces reached. This suggests Truman's view was correct and Roosevelt's, or his cabinet's interpretation of Roosevelt's view, was naive. But we'll never know what Roosevelt himself would have done confronting this evidence. He died before the full scope of Soviet intentions became clear. Would Roosevelt have acknowledged his approach had failed and changed course, doubled down on personal diplomacy, even as evidence mounted, found some middle path Truman missed? We cannot know. Roosevelt's cabinet believed he would have maintained cooperation. Truman believed Roosevelt would have been forced to confront reality as Truman did. Conclusion: the cabinet war that shaped the Cold War. April 12, 1945 to September 1946, approximately 18 months. In that period, Harry Truman inherited a government built around a dead president. Discovered he'd been kept ignorant of crucial information. Confronted a cabinet loyal to Roosevelt's vision, not to him. Systematically replaced nearly every Roosevelt advisor. Shifted American policy from Soviet cooperation to Soviet containment. The political establishment called it ruthless. Historians debate whether it was necessary. What's clear: Truman's willingness to break with Roosevelt's team and the policy vision they represented shaped the Cold War. The cabinet members Truman fired believed they were preserving Roosevelt's legacy of Soviet-American cooperation. Truman believed he was confronting Soviet expansionism that Roosevelt's approach couldn't stop. History vindicated Truman. Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe proved that Stalin's promises were worthless. Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation was based on assumptions Stalin never intended to honor. But the cost of Truman's cabinet purge was real. Political backlash damaged Truman's presidency. Institutional knowledge was lost. Continuity was sacrificed. The Democratic Party fractured. The question remains: could Truman have achieved the same policy shift more gradually, with less political cost? Or was the dramatic break necessary to overcome institutional resistance to seeing Soviet intentions clearly? The institutional lesson: when a leader dies suddenly without preparing a successor, the successor faces two challenges. The information problem, learning what you weren't told. The loyalty problem, overcoming advisors loyal to a predecessor's vision. Truman faced both. His solution, firing nearly everyone, was brutal but effective. Whether it was necessary or excessive remains debatable. What's indisputable: it changed history. The Cold War was shaped in those 18 months when Truman chose to confront Soviet expansion rather than accommodate it, over the objections of cabinet members who believed they were preserving Franklin Roosevelt's legacy. Sometimes institutions must be broken to be saved. Sometimes loyalty to a dead leader's vision becomes opposition to reality. Sometimes new presidents must destroy the old guard to govern effectively. Harry Truman believed all three. He acted accordingly. And the shape of the world for the next 45 years was determined partly by those decisions, made by an accidental president who refused to remain in Franklin Roosevelt's shadow.